You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Risk and impediment identification is the practice of making discovery early and systematic, rather than waiting for problems to erupt into full-blown incidents. The orientation emphasizes that finding risks is not a separate compliance activity, but a routine part of delivery work. By surfacing exposures while stakes are low, teams prevent surprises and protect reliability. This proactive posture depends on discipline, structured scanning, assumption tracking, dependency mapping, and open reporting channels. It also depends on culture, where raising concerns is safe and expected rather than punished. Risks exist across products, processes, technology, people, vendors, and regulations, and each requires its own lens of attention. Impediments, meanwhile, are the practical obstacles, blocked items, fragile interfaces, or capacity gaps that silently erode predictability if ignored. Proactive discovery integrates both, ensuring that delivery remains resilient by spotting weaknesses before they harden into crises. Risk taxonomy organizes exposure across domains so that scanning is comprehensive rather than ad hoc. Categories often include product risks, such as unmet user needs or feature misfit, technology risks like fragile integrations or outdated components, process risks such as bottlenecks or inadequate testing, people risks like turnover or burnout, vendor risks stemming from third-party reliability, and compliance risks tied to regulatory obligations. This taxonomy prevents blind spots that occur when teams only focus on the issues within their immediate control. For example, a system might pass all functional tests yet fail an audit because compliance risks were overlooked. By systematically scanning each domain, teams ensure that identification spans the whole delivery ecosystem. The taxonomy creates a shared language, making risk conversations structured, repeatable, and inclusive across diverse perspectives. Assumption logs provide a disciplined way to record what must be true for success to hold. Each assumption is paired with a planned test or indicator that will reveal drift before failure. For example, a team may assume that vendor latency remains under a given threshold, and pair it with monitoring that alerts when performance worsens. Another assumption might be that adoption will rise after a feature launch, checked through telemetry. Logging assumptions prevents teams from relying silently on untested beliefs that may later collapse. By explicitly pairing assumptions with validation mechanisms, organizations convert invisible risk into manageable signals. This practice reduces ignorance risk, ensures accountability, and makes uncertainty visible. Assumption logs remind teams that delivery is never certainty. It is a series of conditions to monitor, verify, and adjust continuously. Dependency mapping visualizes upstream and downstream relationships, highlighting fragile interfaces and synchronization hazards. In complex systems, one team's changes ripple into others, often in unexpected ways. Mapping dependencies makes these links visible, so risks are anticipated rather than discovered during failure. For example, a product team may depend on an authentication service, which in turn depends on vendor certificates. If any link weakens, the chain falters. Dependency maps also expose synchronization points where multiple teams must align delivery cadence, which are fertile ground for impediments. By making dependencies explicit, teams can plan stubs, contract tests, or sequencing adjustments. This transparency reduces late surprises and reinforces the principle that no team delivers in isolation. Dependencies become manageable elements of flow rather than hidden traps. Leading indicators help teams detect precursors before risks materialize into incidents. Metrics like aging work items, rising error rates, or saturation signals in capacity reveal instability in advance. For example, a backlog full of items stuck in testing may predict defect escapes. A steady climb in latency before outages is another common early warning. These indicators shift the focus from reacting to crises to spotting drift while it is still reversible. By embedding leading signals into reviews and dashboards, teams build an early warning system that increases resilience. Leading indicators transform variance into opportunity, giving teams the time to act proportionately rather than under fire. They reinforce that risks usually announce themselves before failure, if only the system is attentive enough to notice. Premortems invite teams to imagine plausible failure scenarios before they happen. In a premortem, stakeholders assume a project or increment has failed, and then brainstorm what caused it. This exercise surfaces risks, assigns owners, and discusses mitigations while stakes are still low. For example, a team might identify vendor outage or capacity shortfall as hypothetical failure causes, then plan mitigations like backup vendors or stress testing. Premortems broaden imagination, catching exposures that might not surface through routine scanning. They also reduce overconfidence by acknowledging that failure is always possible. By rehearsing failure in advance, organizations make risk less frightening and more manageable. Premortems turn speculation into preparedness, ensuring that when challenges arise, teams already have a head start on mitigation. Hazard reporting channels democratize risk identification by allowing anyone to flag concerns quickly and without fear. These channels might include digital forms, Slack integrations, or anonymous submissions. The key is to make reporting low friction and psychologically safe, so signals are abundant and timely. For example, a support agent who notices unusual user complaints must be able to report without worrying about blame. Hazard channels increase signal density by encouraging diverse observations from all parts of the organization. They transform risk identification from a specialist activity into a collective responsibility. By normalizing hazard reporting, teams multiply their field of view, catching issues that leadership or technical experts might miss. Early warnings thrive when everyone feels empowered to contribute to discovery. Third-party risk checks ensure that vendor posture is not overlooked. Delivery often depends on external partners whose stability, service levels, and compliance affect outcomes directly. Regular reviews of service-level agreements, audit reports, and change notices help anticipate downstream surprises. For example, a vendor announcing a new API version may signal the need for compatibility testing. Similarly, monitoring vendor financial or security posture can reveal risks that eventually cascade into delivery. By treating vendor dependencies as active risks, not static assumptions, organizations expand their resilience. Third-party risk checks embed accountability beyond organizational walls, reinforcing that risk management is ecosystem-wide. They protect against being blindsided by changes outside direct control, a common failure mode when dependency vigilance lapses. Change impact reviews analyze how definition updates, architectural shifts, or environment changes affect reliability and compliance. Delivery systems evolve constantly, but changes carry risk. For example, redefining what counts as a resolved defect alters historical metrics, while infrastructure upgrades may destabilize workflows. By assessing these impacts before changes land, teams avoid misinterpreting signals or triggering failures unexpectedly. Change reviews ask, what assumptions are broken, what dependencies are touched, and what evidence must be updated. They ensure that risk identification keeps pace with evolution, not lagging behind it. This practice demonstrates humility, acknowledging that change itself is a risk vector. By reviewing impacts systematically, organizations balance adaptation with stability, making progress without blind spots. Queue and work-in-process scans uncover hidden impediments that quietly degrade predictability. Queues accumulate when items sit idle, often invisible until cycle times balloon. WIP scans highlight blocked items, excessive multitasking, and context-switching drag. For example, a large queue waiting for testing may suggest capacity imbalance. Too many concurrent starts may expose lack of focus. These signals reveal systemic friction, where flow is obstructed by unseen forces. By scanning regularly, teams detect erosion before it becomes crisis. Q and WIP reviews remind organizations that risks are not only dramatic outages, but also the slow decay of predictability. Surfacing these impediments early allows corrective action such as WIP limits or resource rebalancing to restore flow stability. Skills and capacity audits identify human-centered risks that often remain unspoken until they cause disruption. These audits check for coverage gaps, single points of failure, and signs of burnout. For example, if only one engineer understands a critical system, turnover creates a major exposure. Similarly, chronic overwork reveals unsustainable practices that eventually threaten delivery. Audits make these risks visible, enabling mitigations such as cross-training, staffing adjustments, or load balancing. By addressing capacity and skills proactively, organizations prevent people risks from undermining flow. This practice also signals respect for teams, acknowledging that reliability depends as much on human sustainability as on technical systems. Skills audits align with the broader principle that resilience is built on balance, not heroics. Security and privacy checks integrate threat modeling and data handling reviews into refinement so exposures are addressed early. Instead of treating security as a late-stage audit, reviews embed it into backlog grooming and design sessions. For example, a new feature handling personal data may be assessed for encryption, retention, and consent requirements before development begins. Threat modeling identifies plausible attack vectors, while privacy reviews check compliance with regulations. These checks prevent vulnerabilities from being discovered only after deployment, when remediation is costly. By integrating them into routine refinement, organizations shift left on risk discovery, making protection a first-class concern. This practice reduces both technical and reputational risks, reinforcing that safety is inseparable from delivery reliability. Compliance Trigger Watch keeps organizations ahead of regulatory events, audit cycles, and policy changes. These triggers might include upcoming industry certifications, new data protection laws, or known audit schedules. By monitoring proactively, teams align evidence and design adjustments to requirements before deadlines create crises. For example, if a regulatory change in reporting standards is due next quarter, Compliance Watch ensures telemetry and documentation are updated now. This vigilance integrates external obligations into delivery rhythm, avoiding the whiplash of last-minute compliance scrambles. It demonstrates that proactive identification includes not only internal risks, but also shifts in the regulatory environment. Compliance Trigger Watch protects credibility and ensures delivery remains trustworthy under evolving obligations. Social and stakeholder signals provide a subtler form of risk identification. Silence in meetings, growing contention between groups, or late-breaking objections often indicate misalignment that becomes impediment later. For example, if sponsors disengage from demos or operations teams raise concerns only at release, risks are already present. By tuning into these signals, teams surface interpersonal or organizational misalignments before they become visible crises. These signals remind organizations that risks are not only technical, they also stem from relationships and communication patterns. Surfacing them requires psychological safety, where raising cultural risks is as legitimate as raising defect counts. By listening to the human dimension, organizations prevent friction from hardening into formal impediments. Anti-patterns in risk and impediment identification highlight what undermines resilience. Surprise dependencies, discovered only at integration, reveal a failure to map systems comprehensively. Unowned risks fester without accountability, leading to repeated incidents. We'll handle it later. Deferrals push manageable concerns into future crises. These anti-patterns reinforce why proactive discovery must be routine. They show that avoidance magnifies impact. What is invisible today becomes urgent tomorrow. By naming these pitfalls, organizations sustain vigilance. They remind teams that risks ignored are risks accepted, and impediments deferred are impediments multiplied. Avoiding anti-patterns is essential for maintaining credibility and protecting delivery reliability. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. An intake workflow ensures that every risk or impediment raised in conversation is logged with context, ownership, and a next step. Without such a system, issues often vanish into notes, chats, or memories, only to resurface later as crises. A disciplined intake process creates a visible record that nothing has been lost. For example, if a developer flags a fragile dependency, the intake workflow requires capturing what was observed, who owns resolution, and when it will be revisited. Even low-severity items receive a placeholder, so they can be monitored. Intake makes risk identification systematic rather than ad hoc, turning observations into actionable entries. This practice transforms fleeting concerns into traceable artifacts, building trust that the system listens and responds. By ensuring visibility and accountability, intake workflows anchor proactive discovery in structure rather than chance. Severity and likelihood scoring provide a lightweight triage mechanism that prevents organizations from drowning in unprioritized risks. Every identified exposure is scored along two axes: how much harm it could cause and how likely it is to occur. This simple matrix clarifies where attention is most urgently needed. For example, a highly probable vendor service delay that causes minor inconvenience may be managed differently than a low-probability data breach with catastrophic consequences. Scoring does not demand perfect precision, but offers a shared language for relative priority. It ensures that scarce resources are directed where impact is greatest, preventing teams from overreacting to minor irritants while ignoring slow-burning hazards. By applying consistent scoring, reviews become sharper and more defensible, showing that attention reflects deliberate prioritization rather than arbitrary concern. Detection playbooks define where and how to look for risks on a routine cadence. Instead of relying on memory or intuition, teams follow checklists that guide systematic scanning across dashboards, code repositories, contracts, and field reports. For example, a weekly detection playbook might include reviewing aging work items, scanning error logs for anomalies, and checking vendor change notices. A monthly playbook may involve contract reviews or compliance trigger scans. By institutionalizing these routines, organizations reduce dependence on heroics and ensure consistency over time. Detection playbooks also train new members quickly, transferring tacit knowledge into explicit practice. They make risk identification predictable, repeatable, and teachable. This structure turns discovery into a managed process rather than sporadic effort, ensuring that weak signals are not missed simply because no one thought to look in the right place. Field observation and Gemba walks capture ground truth that dashboards and reports may miss. The Japanese term gemba refers to going to the place where work happens to see reality firsthand. For example, sitting with support staff may reveal that users consistently misinterpret a feature, while walking through operations may expose manual workarounds invisible in metrics. Observing directly at the front line uncovers risks and impediments that data cannot surface. It also builds empathy, reminding leaders that numbers abstract away messy realities. Field observation prevents overconfidence in dashboards and ensures that identification reflects lived experience. It balances quantitative signals with qualitative insights, ensuring that discovery is grounded in what actually happens. This practice anchors risk identification in context, showing that vigilance requires both measurement and presence. Spike investigations are short, time-boxed explorations of uncertain areas to reduce ignorance risk. A spike might probe whether a new vendor's API meets performance thresholds, whether a planned architecture is compatible with legacy systems, or whether regulatory changes will apply to upcoming features. Spikes produce specific findings and decisions rather than lingering research. For example, a team may allocate 2 days to test encryption libraries, producing a go-no-go recommendation. By constraining time and scope, spikes convert vague uncertainty into bounded knowledge. They reduce the risk of surprises by surfacing evidence early. Spikes demonstrate that proactive discovery is not only about finding risks already visible, but also about intentionally exploring unknowns. They embody humility, acknowledging that ignorance is itself a risk to be managed deliberately. Canary and synthetic checks provide continuous probing of critical user journeys and interfaces. Canary checks release features to a small cohort to monitor for degradation before broad rollout, while synthetic checks simulate transactions to test availability even when real users are quiet. For example, synthetic monitoring may continuously run sample purchases through a checkout system, alerting if performance slows. Canary exposure allows organizations to observe outcomes safely under controlled conditions. Together, these checks ensure that delivery systems are always under watch, with risks detected before they escalate into wide-scale incidents. By embedding these probes, teams move from reactive firefighting to proactive surveillance. Canary and synthetic checks embody the principle that risk discovery is a constant practice, not an episodic review. Contract tests and backward compatibility checks protect against breaking consumers as interfaces evolve. When services or APIs change, downstream consumers risk failure unless compatibility is maintained. Contract tests verify that expectations between producer and consumer remain valid. For example, if a payment service alters response codes, contract tests confirm whether dependent systems still function. Backward compatibility checks ensure that new versions do not break old ones unless explicitly deprecated. By embedding these tests, organizations discover integration risks before they reach users. They transform hidden fragility into visible signals. This practice reinforces that risks are not just technical defects, but relationship failures between systems. By making these checks routine, teams prevent surprises and preserve trust in evolving ecosystems. Environment health reviews verify that infrastructure is stable before major changes land. Reviews check for parity across environments, capacity headroom, and rollback readiness. For example, if production and staging diverge, tests may provide false reassurance. If capacity is already saturated, new releases may tip the system into instability. Environment reviews surface these risks early, ensuring that changes land on solid ground. They also verify that rollback mechanisms are ready, so recovery is possible if problems occur. By embedding health checks into cadence, organizations reduce the risk of environmental surprises. They acknowledge that reliability depends as much on the runway for change as on the change itself. Environment health reviews transform infrastructure from a silent assumption into an active dimension of risk management. Psychological safety reinforcement ensures that risk reporting remains candid even after uncomfortable discoveries. Without safety, people conceal issues to avoid blame, undermining proactive discovery. For example, if raising a defect leads to punishment, future risks remain hidden until they explode. Reinforcement comes through explicit norms, leadership modeling, and non-punitive handling of early warnings. Celebrating timely risk reporting as a positive act builds trust that honesty is safer than silence. Psychological safety ensures that hazard channels remain alive and that teams surface risks as soon as they appear. It acknowledges that risks are inevitable and that resilience comes from openness, not perfection. By reinforcing safety, organizations create a culture where vigilance thrives and where proactive discovery becomes everyone's responsibility. Cross-team risk forums bring exposures into shared view when they span boundaries. Many risks emerge from interactions, integrations, sequencing, shared platforms where no single team has full ownership. Forums create a structured space for surfacing these risks and coordinating mitigations. For example, teams dependent on the same data pipeline may use the forum to align on changes, preventing surprises. Forums also prevent local optimization, where one group reduces its own risk at the expense of others. By surfacing exposures collectively, organizations treat risks as systemic rather than isolated. This collaboration strengthens resilience by ensuring that mitigations are coherent across boundaries. Cross-team forums make risk identification a collective discipline, acknowledging that no team operates alone in modern delivery ecosystems. Vendor escalation paths define rapid channels for resolving third-party issues when they materialize. Since many risks originate from dependencies outside direct control, organizations must plan in advance how to escalate. Paths include designated contacts, evidence-sharing protocols, and joint timelines for resolution. For example, if a cloud provider experiences instability, escalation paths ensure that data flows quickly between partners, minimizing downtime. By defining these paths in advance, organizations avoid the chaos of negotiating under stress. Vendor escalation reinforces that proactive discovery includes preparing for response as much as detection. It acknowledges that external risks are inevitable, but unmanaged escalation multiplies their harm. By embedding clear paths, organizations maintain accountability and continuity even when external partners falter. Compliance-friendly tracking ties risks directly to the evidence and approvals regulators require. For example, when a risk is logged about data retention, compliance systems should link the mitigation to specific policy requirements and approval records. This integration ensures that proactive discovery remains auditable and defensible. It prevents the duplication of tracking in parallel compliance documents by embedding governance directly into normal workflows. By linking compliance evidence with risks, organizations demonstrate to auditors that exposures were identified, monitored, and addressed continuously. This approach also reduces audit stress, since evidence accrues naturally. Compliance-friendly tracking makes risk management both agile and accountable, aligning vigilance with regulatory trust. It shows that proactive discovery is not only operationally wise but also legally protective. Learning capture distills detection wins and misses into reusable patterns. Each identified risk, whether caught early or missed until late, offers lessons. For example, if a canary check revealed a performance regression before users complained, that success becomes a case study. Conversely, if a dependency issue was discovered only during release, the gap becomes a trigger to strengthen mapping practices. By recording these lessons systematically, organizations improve their detection heuristics. Learning capture prevents repetition of mistakes and compounds wisdom across teams. It also builds humility, acknowledging that risk discovery is never perfect, but always improvable. Capturing and sharing patterns ensures that vigilance matures over time, making future identification sharper, faster, and more reliable. Success indicators validate whether proactive discovery is working. These indicators include fewer late surprises, faster impediment clearance, and steadier delivery flow. For example, if incident frequency declines because risks were surfaced early, success is evident. If teams report reduced rework because impediments were identified during refinement, the system is functioning. Stakeholder confidence may rise as they see delivery proceed with fewer crises. These signals confirm that structured scanning, low-friction reporting, and systematic triage produce tangible benefits. Success evidence prevents risk practices from becoming ritual. It proves their value and outcomes. By monitoring indicators, organizations sustain investment in proactive discovery, reinforcing that early vigilance pays dividends in reliability, trust, and alignment. Proactive identification synthesis emphasizes that resilience comes from structured scanning, low-friction reporting, quick triage, and coordinated follow-through. Taxonomies ensure comprehensive coverage. Assumption logs and dependency maps make uncertainty explicit, and leading indicators provide early warning. Pre-mortems, hazard channels, and third-party reviews surface risks before they escalate. Intake workflows, scoring, playbooks, and forums make the system disciplined and collaborative. Psychological safety ensures honesty, while compliance integration ensures defensibility. Learning capture and success indicators close the loop, demonstrating that vigilance produces measurable benefits. Together, these practices transform risk identification from a reactive scramble into a continuous, proactive discipline. They prevent small issues from becoming large crises, ensuring that delivery is not only fast, but also resilient and trustworthy under changing conditions. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.